We begin our preview of the 2019 college football season next on Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. Hit. Caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it and a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
Win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, and welcome to our latest episode of Michigan Podcast. I am Steve Deace, and the season is just about 70 days away, if you can believe it, even less than that. We're about, 40 days or so until Big Ten Media Days. So we're going to begin here on Michigan Podcast. We're going to begin our deep dive looking ahead to the 2019 college football season over the course of our next several episodes. Bill Bender from the Sporting News and one of the main contributors to Street and Smith's College Football. He'll be joining us to give us a national perspective on our Wolverines, the Big Ten, and the entire college football landscape. That's coming up later in this episode. But I thought we would start off by sharing with you one of the key metrics I put together before I start putting together my college football preview every year. And if you're a Phil Steele fan, you know that he always talks about his 9 sets of power ratings. Well, you've got to create some criteria and structure before you start putting together your ratings. And when you run into situations, particularly due to a preview like I do, which is really a forecast more than a preview, you're predicting outcomes months before they happen. So what do you do when you run into what are, for lots of teams, a myriad of toss-up games? Well, one of the things I've come up with in recent years is my own coaching hot board, because I do think in those games, coaching makes a big difference when the talent is relatively even. And I come up with this every year before I start my preview. And the coaching hot board, if you want to read this, by the way, it's published as we speak. You can go find it at Wolverine Digest and read it there at wolverinedigest.com. But the coaching hot board has several criteria that help me to rate how we do rank every coach in college football, and really the college football that matters the most, the Power Five, meaning the 5 Power 5 conferences, and then plus Notre Dame. There's 5 criteria that I use on ranking the coaches. Here they are one by one. First, I look at each coach's Power 5 head coaching overall resume, and then I give it an assessment of a score between 1 and 10, and that's assessing what each head coach has done strictly as a Power 5 head coach. All right. So weighing that 1 to 10 means it's weighed pretty heavily. Then I assess their non-Power 5 head coaching overall resume. And this assesses what each head coach has done either as a group of 5 head coach or a Power 5 top assistant coach or an NFL head or assistant coach. And that's weighted just not quite as heavily. And it's weighted on a scale of 1 to 5. And then we look at the current coaching trajectory, and this is scaled again pretty heavily, 1 to 10. And this is an assessment of whether the needle for the next 4 years, which is a full recruiting cycle, is pointed up or down at this stage for each coach's career. We then look at a big game bonus. You get points, bonus points 1 to 3 on that if the coach is known for producing in big games as a head coach at the Power 5 level. Can I go back for a second to the coaching trajectory? This is a key tiebreaker as well. So when we show you where the coaches are ranked, you're going to see a lot of coaches that have the same point totals on, because there's only 31 possible points. So there's a lot of ties. And the coaching trajectory is the first tiebreaker, meaning if the momentum in the next 4 years in your career is pointed upwards compared to whom you're tied with, then you get placed ahead of them. Finally, there's the Hall of Fame bonus. And this is for coaches that are obviously destined for the College Football Hall of Fame for college coaching only. And it's based on their accomplishments up until this point, meaning if they didn't coach another game, if their resumes were fulfilled at this moment, would they be inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in Atlanta, Georgia? And if the answer to that question is yes, they were given 3 bonus points. And if the answer to that question was anything other than yes, like maybe, we're not sure, or no, they weren't given any. So with that criteria laid out, here's the rankings of first of all, we'll start with these are the top 10 coaches in college football. And it won't shock anybody that Nick Saban and Dabo Swinney are 1 and 2. And you can see there's definitely a line of demarcation between them and Jimbo Fisher at A&M. Those are the only 3 active coaches right now that have national championships. So it would make sense that they would be ahead of the rest of the field. Chris Peterson at Washington comes in at 4th. Brian Kelly at Notre Dame is 5, tied with Gary Patterson and Chip Kelly and Mark D'Antonio at Michigan State. So those resumes are all very similar. Our own Jim Harbaugh comes in number 9, and then number 10. And when you see a coach with italics on this list, it means they're in their first year. Mac Brown comes in at number 10. I mean, if you just look at his resume at his previous stop at North Carolina, then of course what he did at Texas for a decade, he's a Hall of Famer, no doubt about it. So he walks into Chapel Hill with quite the coaching resume, and that's why he is rated one of the top 10 coaches in the country. As we go down further on the list, you can see, one of the difficult things is measuring what do you do with the new hotshot coaches like Lincoln Riley and Kirby Smart. Both of those guys, Kirby Smart is going into year 4. You have Lincoln Riley going into year 3. So what do you do with those guys whose resumes aren't quite as developed yet? So that's why some people may look at Lincoln Riley only being 11th, Kirby Smart at 13th. And say, hey, they probably should be better than that. And you might be right. But when you consider how little head coaching experience they have compared to everybody else, I would tell you that this metric probably gives them a lot of due. And if they have the kinds of seasons this fall that a lot of people expect, you'll definitely see them in the top 10. Mike Leach at Washington State is number 12. Dan Mullen at Florida. David Shaw at Stanford. Les Miles at Kansas, who should be italicized there as a new head coach, his first year there. But good luck. That's probably the toughest job in the entire Power 5. Tom Herman at Texas. If you're looking for other Big Ten guys, Pat Fitzgerald at Northwestern is number 18. Kirk Ferentz at Iowa is number 22. Jeff Brom at Purdue is 23rd. Scott Frost at Nebraska is 26th. James Franklin is 27th, and Paul Chryst is 28th. So those guys are all relatively close to one another. PJ Fleck at Minnesota comes in as the 30th ranked head coach. But you can see there's not a lot of difference there. I mean, really, the top 20 to the top 40 are really separated by only 5 points. Now, if you're morbidly curious, who are, according to this survey, the worst current coaches in college football? Well, I don't think it would shock anybody to see the Rutgers coach, Chris Ash, who I've known Chris for years. Great guy. but he's in a difficult position. He's dead last right now. Jonathan Smith at Oregon State, Chad Morris at Arkansas, Tom Allen at Indiana, Lovie Smith at Illinois. So 3 of the 5 lowest ranked coaches. And if you go up a little bit higher, Mike Loxley at Maryland, it's his first year. So 4 of the 7 worst coaches in these rankings all come from the Big Ten Conference. So this is a good way of kind of measuring when good on good or mediocre on mediocre, who's got the coaching edge that could make the advantage in a game where a decision or two swings the outcome. And that's why one of the first things I do every year before I start ranking how I think the teams will finish is I start ranking how good are the guys that are going to be coaching those teams. Bill Bender from Street and Smith's College Football and the Sporting News will join us to give his national take on where the 2019 Wolverines, the Big Ten, and the rest of the college football landscape stands in a moment. And now we start taking a look at what the nation thinks about our Wolverines, the Big Ten, and the college football landscape. Magazines are hitting the shelves all over the country. One of them, Street and Smith's College Football Preview. One of their contributors, Bill Bender from the Sporting News, is here with us this week on Michigan Podcast. Good to see you again, Bill. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
So looking at a lot of the preseason magazines, Street and Smith's has Michigan number 11, which seems to be one of the more conservative rankings of the Wolverines. A lot of surveys kind of seem to think that this is kind of the do it or get off the pot year for Jim Harbaugh and the Wolverines with what they have coming back on offense, the transition and changes that have gone on at Ohio State. Penn State's kind of become transfer portal U this offseason. Michigan State has one of the oddest coaching shufflings you'll ever see, where it's all the same coaches, just in different positions. So where do you come down on Michigan? Are you as bullish as people who think they're a legit playoff contender, or are you more on the conservative side with Street and Smith's putting the Wolverines at number 11?
Well, as usual, I'm probably mostly in the middle. As I've been on your show before, and I've been pretty moderate about Jim Harbaugh. I don't get caught up in the hot takes that he should be fired, or it's that, like you said, do it or get off the pot year, because I really don't think it is that. I think he's upgraded the Michigan program. They win 10 games a year. 3 of the last 4 years, they have the 9th best winning percentage among Power 5 programs. But they are in that kind of Mark Richt spot that Richt was in Georgia, in that we're to the point now where we only pay attention to Michigan and Jim Harbaugh when they lose, particularly when they lose that last game against Ohio State. And I think that's the danger, Steve. You've probably shed some more light on this, that the danger with them this year is that it becomes a 1-game referendum instead of a 12-game one.
Is there any way to avoid that, though? When it's I went and looked at it historically at Ohio State, and because they're the one of the blue blood programs. Miami went through downturns. Alabama has, just in the pre-Saban era, they did. Michigan finally had it went a decade where it basically barely averaged 7 wins a year and had 3 losing seasons. Notre Dame just went 4-8 3 years ago. And before that, you had Charlie Weiss going 3-9. USC has had down periods. The one school in the last 60 years that has not had a down period is Ohio State. And if you go back since Woody Hayes' first national championship team, which I think was like in 1951, they have won 73% of their games, regardless of who the head coach is, since 1951. And so what that tells you about Ryan Day is that if he has the new Ohio State coach, if he has full motor function, if he can walk and chew gum at the same time, his floor is he's going to win 73% of his games. And now the greatness at Ohio State is measured by, Urban Meyer was winning 85% of his games. So that greatness is measured in how much more above that 73% at Ohio State do you get? And a lot of that's going to depend on your record against Michigan. Just ask John Cooper, right? Well, if you look at Jim Harbaugh, he's in the same boat, Bill. He's 38. If we would have told you, given where the Michigan program was, where we were giving away tickets for Coke Zeros on campus when we hired him, if we would have told you the day he was hired that he was going to go 38-10, people would have thought he's going to need more time to recruit than that. Hell, I remember Colin Cowherd and those guys on Fox before the Utah game saying it was going to be 4 years before they were a ranked team. Okay. He's 38-10 in college football against everybody not named Urban Meyer. That's 82%. That's college football Hall of Fame stuff. So I don't know, given they're in the same division, we don't have shared championships in this league anymore. You're almost never going to win a Big Ten title at either school without beating the other one. I don't know how this is debatable because he's done everything else at Michigan except that top line. And there's one team standing in the way of that top line, right?
Yeah, and some of those criticisms lobbed at Harbaugh are patently unfair. I mean, you look at what he's done against Penn State. They are 3-1 against Penn State under Harbaugh, and Franklin's 1-4 against Michigan and 3-12 against Michigan, Michigan State, and Ohio State. If you look at what the Michigan State rivalry, they're 2-2 against each other, but Michigan State needed a punt fumble in one of those games and a monsoon, if I remember that game correctly. There was a weather delay.
Noah's Ark was parked out front. Yes. Yeah.
Well, it was like that for both teams, but still, it contributed. He's beat Wisconsin 2 out of 3 games. He's beat Scott Frost. He's beat Jeff Brom. When you do Big Ten coach rankings, right now without Urban Meyer, I would argue Jim Harbaugh's number 1 as a default setting, of course, with a short-term kind of exception that, you know, if they lose to Penn State, Michigan State, and Ohio State this year, you can't put them 1 next year, and I can defend that. But like you said about Ryan Day, I would argue the only down period Ohio State's had was with Earl Bruce in the 80s, where they weren't necessarily a national championship contender, but John Cooper changed that. He just couldn't beat Michigan. But since John Cooper, and we're talking like early 90s and about a quarter century of time, I would also argue that Michigan was the more talented team against Ohio State in maybe 3 out of the last 25 games, maybe 4 if you want to stretch it, maybe.
So one of the ironies, Bill, is I got to know Earl Bruce very well because I live in Iowa and he has really strong ties to our home state. And when I was first starting out in sports talk radio, he took over our arena football team. And I had been critical of what our arena league owner was saying about how crappy his arena was. And I'm like, hey, you're literally telling people don't come to the games. And he didn't like me ripping the team. And he knew I was a big Michigan fan. And so when they hired Earl Bruce, he thought I'd appreciate getting to know Earl and hearing a bunch of old stories, you know, about Ohio State. And so you mentioned him. He was 9-3 like virtually every year. He actually had a winning record against Bo Schembechler. So he had a winning record against Bo. He averaged about 8.5 wins a year. And you're right. Since 1951, that's considered the down period. You're right. Yeah. You're right.
And like you said, with Michigan, and I was saying this one game referendum thing, Earl Bruce lost some games outside of Michigan that got him in trouble.
Well, it was the 4th and 27 Marv Cook first down against Iowa that probably got him fired, right?
Right. Yeah. And that game, and we all remember it. Well, some people might remember that one. I do, at least. And with Michigan, I think the one thing Jim Harbaugh has done he takes care of business against the unranked teams. Mm-hmm. You know, there isn't that embarrassing Maryland loss, or outside of Iowa, at Iowa at night, there hasn't been that. I can't believe they lost.
And that was kind of Lloyd Carr's thing. If you look at Lloyd Carr's record, he was great against top 10 teams. And then you give the ball to a fullback on 4th and goal against Jim Coletto's Purdue and lose, right? There was always that 1 or 2 games a year where Michigan's teams under Carr just never bothered to show up. That was kind of the Lloyd Carr MO, right? Losing to those kinds of teams.
Yeah. And well, I would ask you this question because I feel like we're having a good back and forth about this. Is that where Michigan is now? Or are they stuck in that spot where they were maybe just before the App State game, essentially, where you knew Michigan was good and good enough to wake up and win 8 or 9 games and run off tackle and beat the Illinois in the, you know, they won big games with Lloyd Carr late too, but it was something that held them back from being something more. And I think that's what this Josh Gaddis hire, in theory, might produce. You know, are they actually going to open it up and throw it around? Are they actually going to go out? We've seen them beat Notre Dame, Michigan State, Penn State. Is this the team that can break through and get to the playoff? They were talented enough to play in the playoff last year. I don't think they were talented enough to beat Clemson or Alabama, though.
So I think this is a really good. You're right. I think this is the key conversation about where the Michigan program is at. And you look at Don Brown's defense. See, I think that's the number one reason we haven't suffered those face planting upsets that even when we were really good, we used to have in the previous era. And the reason why is because his defense, if you recruit as well or better than us, and we saw this with Ohio State last year, there's so much man coverage on the field that if we don't get to the quarterback, you can't cover those guys that long. And then we saw 3 Ohio State receivers go to the combine and run sub 4.4s, right? You weren't going to cover those guys down the field. How many college teams have that? 5, 4 a year. That's about it. And only one team in the Big Ten has that virtually every year, and that's Ohio State. Now, Michigan might have that this year, actually. And so the reason Don Brown's defense has saved us from a lot of those face-planting upsets is we play so much aggressive man-to-man, our guy is better than yours, man-to-man kind of style defense, that we overwhelm those teams athletically. You don't get a chance, you don't hang around with us, bend but don't break, and we give up a bunch of cheap field goals, and then we don't convert in the red zone, and suddenly it's a fourth quarter game. With Don's defense, if those second-tier teams in the Big Ten just don't have the athletes on the outside to exploit it. And so the good news is it's kept us out of those face-planting, embarrassing losses. The bad news is when we get into games with teams that recruit as good or better than us, the offense has not shown that it's explosive enough to move off of, of its preferred narrative. Jim is not conservative. He's arrogant. When Jake Rudock was here, we couldn't run the ball a lick. So we turned Jake Rudock into a 3,000-yard passer in a span of 7 games because he just gave up running the ball and threw the ball all the time. People forget how good of a season Wilton Speight was having until he hurt his arm against his shoulder against Iowa. At the end of the 2016 season. Last year they changed to a zone read scheme with Shea Patterson. So it's not a conservative approach. It's been a stubborn one. He likes to impose his will. And we've kind of reached the max of teams in college football now that we can do that against. You're not going to impose your will against Ohio State, against Georgia, against Clemson, against Alabama, Oklahoma. And that's the next zip code that we kind of need to move into. And so if you're going to compete with those teams, then even if you play good defense, you're going to need 30 or 35 points to win those kinds of games. You need an offense that when you're down to Ohio State in the third quarter by 2 scores, you're not running a play action pass, 7-step drop with your quarterbacks back to the line of scrimmage on 3rd and 6. You know what I'm saying? And I think this is why the Josh Gaddis hire was huge. Jim is a freaking quarterback. He's not opposed to throwing the ball. When I hear critics say he's Les Miles, I laugh at that. All right. The issue is it's more stubbornness than conservatism. And so when Jim giving up the offense to Josh Gaddis, that is him being essentially the mercenary coach we thought we were hiring, where he is now saying, you know what, man, I have my way of doing things, but you know what I like even more than my way of doing things? Not listen to you guys bitch all offseason about losing to Ohio State. I like that better. All right. And so I think that was sort of the last evolution that he had to make. And the timing of it is perfect. It's the deepest receiver core Michigan's had probably in 15 years. I think it's the deepest quarterback room in college football. And we have a senior quarterback who ran this exact system prolifically at Ole Miss. There's not a lot of teams on our schedule that are equipped to play all those receivers in space. So and the running back situation's a little precarious right now with some injuries. So I think this is the perfect time to go to a scheme like this.
Well, and the Ohio State game was the perfect time, like you said, a team that before last year, Johnny Dixon and Paris Campbell and even KJ Hill, who's back this year, those guys weren't, Terry McLaurin being the other one, they weren't NFL receivers. They were okay, but with the Brian Hartline hire, that was the one thing with Zach Smith, and the scandal there is Ohio State actually hired a good receivers coach in Brian Hartline, and he's outstanding at it. And those guys developed into NFL receivers. Michigan has 3 NFL caliber receivers before Josh Gaddis in Peoples-Jones, Tariq Black, Nico Collins. Those guys are going to play on Sunday. So now you have to use them while you have them. I thought, you look at Michigan's receiving stats last year, there's no way that Donovan Peoples-Jones shouldn't be at least 800 to 1,000-yard receiver now. Same with Collins. Tariq's got to stay healthy, obviously. And you mentioned the running backs. It's a little, without Chris Evans, we're going to see what some guys can do. But I think it is the perfect time to turn that loose. And if you look what Alabama did last year, before that, really – even with Jalen Hurts to some extent, they were conservative game manager, imposed their will, like you just said. Last year that changed with Tua and those receivers because you had Waddle and Judy and Devontae Smith and Ruggs. That I could go on. They had about 6 of them. And if Michigan's offense looks like that in the Big Ten, they're going to be in business with a guy like Shea Patterson that can spread it around. And I think the biggest coup, as again, like you just said, is the fact that with all this transfer portal coming and going, Michigan was able to hold on to Dylan McCaffrey. I think that was one of the underrated, essentially, keeps of the offseason.
Agreed. And just to clarify one more point on the stubborn aspect, you go back to last year's Michigan-Penn State game is a great example of what I mean. So the final score said that game was 42-14. But if you watched the game, it wasn't that close. Michigan left 2 or 3 touchdowns on the field just because Harbaugh so enjoyed cramming the ball down their throats and humiliating them, that when we got into short yardage situations, in plus territories or just outside of the field goal range, we'd bog down on 3rd down and 3 or 4th and 2 and couldn't get a first down because he just knew they weren't going to score on our defense. And so that's how the guy is wired. All right. And I think Michigan went into that Ohio State game thinking, we've done this to every other team on the schedule. We're going to do this to these guys as well. And they weren't able to do it to them. And it got away from them. And I think that was a humbling experience, not in terms of conservative versus openness schematically, but in terms of stubbornness, flexibility in terms of the scheme that you play. I think that was quite the learning experience. And then on the Florida game was a disaster, but this covering the sport nationally. You don't know when you get outside these playoff games and maybe the Rose Bowl, you have no idea who shows up for any of the rest of these bowl games anymore. How many players want to play and everything else. So you throw to me, I tend to throw bowl games out nowadays. I don't even look at them anymore in terms of how I assess a team the next season.
Well, how are you supposed to assess Michigan's playing that game without 2 first-round picks on the defense and Karan Higdon? And it did get away from them there, but I think the Ohio State game, it's an interesting point because what Ohio State did in that game defensively was they went back to a base defense and more base concepts, didn't really get cute, didn't creep linebackers in the hole because they just got torched by Maryland the week before. And if Michigan, you watched how Maryland
that's a great point you're making, because essentially Ohio State dared Michigan, dared them and said, hey, if you're willing to get outside of your box, we can't stop you. But we are not going to let you run your base offense by catching us out of position. They dared Michigan to make adjustments. They dared them to they kind of did the opposite of the team that says, we know we can't stop you, so we're going to put 9 in the box and see if we can at least get a few turnovers. They kind of did the opposite of that. And Michigan still looked at that and said, yeah, we're not going to attack the flanks. We're not going to go outside. We know you're daring us and you're giving us all of this extra space and area. And then in the end of the second quarter, they did it for 2 drives, remember, and they got 2 quick touchdowns when they did it. And other than that, the rest of the game, they kind of just went back to, we're going to treat you like we did Indiana. We're going to treat you like we did, Northwestern and everybody else we played this year. And that dog wasn't going to hunt.
Well, that game ended on the fake punt, or not the fake punt, the block punt.
Yeah.
That was ball. I was at that game, and that's when I kind of turned, as a journalist, you're like, well, I can start writing now.
Yeah.
Because you kind of knew everything else on top of that was going to just be ugly. And it was. And again, this will be, Ryan Day will have to answer these challenges now because that was a lot of his design, great offense, but he inherits a program, like you said, that has to come out. I always make the joke as being a kid from Central Ohio that, you can wake up and win 7 or 8 at Ohio State. Sure. It's another 4 that make you Urban Meyer. Urban Meyer was awesome in big games. Top 10 games the last 3 to 4 years. I think it was the last 4 years. The only top 10 teams that beat Ohio State were Clemson with Deshaun Watson and Baker Mayfield led Oklahoma in the shoe. And I was at both of those games. And one, I wasn't at the Clemson game. I was at the Oklahoma game though. And Baker was on that night. So you have to be good to beat Ohio State. And in turn, Ryan Day is going to get tested by Fitzgerald in Northwestern, Nebraska at Nebraska. Wisconsin comes to Columbus, and that's before the so-called other big 3 games in the Big Ten East with Michigan, Michigan State, and Penn State. So it's going to be a lot of on-the-job training for Ryan Day this year. And again, I think Harbaugh, what he's done is mastered just about everything else. And even though Michigan's schedule this year, Army's not going to be easy. That's that one that you may bite your fingernails a little bit because Army's a good football team. I still think Michigan's going to win that game. But then you get in the conference schedule and you're talking about at Wisconsin, at Penn State, Iowa comes in. Notre Dame in the middle of October and right back to back with Penn State. There's a lot of things that they can't get distracted by the Ohio State thing, knowing that this was a team last year, Steve, I thought, and you and I talked about it. Last year they did an outstanding job. People make fun of the revenge tour now. I thought it was brilliant because it kept them focused week to week leading up to the Ohio State game.
One game, if they win the Ohio State game, that revenge tour ranks up there with some of the best gimmicks in modern college football history. But since they lost it, people treat it like when Miami got off the plane in the '87 Fiesta Bowl with the camo and then lost to Penn State. But that's what that brings us full circle. It's in this whole, for both programs now, symbiotically, they simply, and it's been this way for a long time, but the old system, you had shared titles and you could kind of do an end run every now and then. But now the way that it is set up, neither program is getting where they want to go without going through the other. That's just the reality of it. It's a total symbiotic relationship now. One's Batman and the other's the Joker. It's just a matter of your interpretation of who's who in that arrangement. Let's look at your national predictions. We'll put them up here on the screen that you've put out for the Sporting News. So these are your projections of how you think the New Year's Day 6, the major games in college football, who will be in those games this postseason. You like Notre Dame getting back to the New Year's 6 against Central Florida as the Group of 5 representative. In the Orange Bowl, you have Syracuse as the second team out of the ACC, which would then go against Florida out of the SEC. You have Michigan against Oregon in the Rose Bowl. And Michigan hasn't been to a Rose Bowl since 2007, so the Wolverines would love to go back. Not as much as they like to be in the playoff, but they would certainly not look at that as a consolation prize. The Big 12 SEC Sugar Bowl, you have Georgia against Oklahoma, and that's really been a game that's been a haven for upsets because one of the two conferences that makes that game tends to be the guy that's disappointed he didn't make the playoffs, like when Alabama lost to Oklahoma or Utah, Georgia last year to Texas. So that's always a game where there tends to be one team that really wants to be there, another team that kind of doesn't. And then the college football playoff, you've got Clemson. So you do think Texas is back. You've got Clemson against Texas in the Fiesta Bowl. And then in the other semifinal, you've got Alabama and Ohio State. Kind of give us, the skinny in the background on your predictions for the season.
Well, first I'll start with the Notre Dame Central Florida game. I think Central Florida is still the best Group of 5 school. I mean, you could throw in a Boise State there, Fresno State there. I think Notre Dame.
That would be against their old quarterback, Brandon Winbush, too, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That would be fun.
Yeah.
That would be fun. And Steve, I'll be honest, sometimes if the opportunity presents itself, we have some fun with those bowl matchups. I did think about that a little bit.
Sure.
Syracuse might scoff at, but if you look at the schedule, Syracuse could easily win 10 games. They play Clemson early. They could have a chance to get that ACC bid there. I mean, obviously, as you said, the Sugar Bowl is kind of a consolation prize of sorts for Big 12 and SEC. I don't see that changing. Michigan and Ohio State are kind of interchangeable. So I'll walk you through my playoff process with Texas because here's how I came to that. I think Alabama and Clemson, we treat that like bingo at this point. You get 2 free spaces on the board. Until somebody proves they're not a playoff team, we'll continue to project them.
Because here's the thing: we know that for one of them not to make it, they have to lose twice.
Correct.
And even then, I'm not so sure, depending on what everybody else did, one of them still wouldn't. So that they each have to lose twice to not make it, which makes it really hard not to put them both in. Yeah, automatically.
And on top of that, Steve, their schedules this year are super friendly.
Particularly Clemson's. I mean,
correct.
Clemson's toughest game isn't in their conference. It's Texas A&M at home in September. That's their toughest game.
Their 2 toughest games are in September. You can almost pencil that in before we get, into October if they take care of business there. So you got 2. And then I don't think the Pac-12 has a playoff contender. I don't think the Group of 5 gets one either. So that's 2 that we're taking off the board. So it becomes this. Do you take the Big 12 and the Big 10 champion, or do you take one of those and maybe throw in the SEC's second team, which could be Georgia because they're going to be pretty good as well. Mm-hmm. I think Notre Dame's schedule's tough enough with the Stanford, Michigan. They've got road games. And Georgia, of course. Georgia in September on the road, where I don't think they're a playoff. So, to me, the value judgment is this. Do you think Ohio State is better than Michigan. I'm going to make Michigan prove it and beat Ohio State before I say they're a playoff contender.
I can't blame you for that whatsoever. Sure.
That's most people's thinking right now, even if they're even. Go out and prove it. Texas, Oklahoma, it's not as crazy as people sound when I tell you Texas has beat them 3 times in the last 6 years. Texas beat them in the regular season last year. Texas has the experienced quarterback in Sam Ehlinger. Texas has a ton of momentum. And you'll say, they lost 8 guys on defense. Well, that defense was bad. So I'm thinking that the experience that they're bringing in through recruiting and the talent that Tom Herman has is going to be better than Oklahoma. And I honestly think that's a coin flip too. So to me, the 2 spots, if we're playing away from the free spots, it really becomes, is it Oklahoma or Texas? Is it Michigan or Ohio State? And does the SEC have 2 playoff teams? Those are really the only 3 questions you have to answer to kind of fit the playoff puzzle to me.
Well, Bill, I'll leave you with this. I can't argue with any of your reasoning whatsoever. I'll leave you with this. It's the 150th season of college football, and we're kind of overdue for a zany. You think of zany seasons. The 2007 is the most recent example. In 1990, we had 6 different teams get ranked number 1. The Big Ten had 4 teams tie for the Big Ten championship. Colorado won the national title with a 5th down at Missouri, and they had a loss and a tie, and they shared it that year with Georgia Tech of all teams. So we are overdue for a zany year. And with this being the 150th season of the sport, I kind of think this might be the time we get one. And part of that is we haven't had a Kansas State beating Oklahoma in a Big 12 championship game out of nowhere in several years. And I kind of think this might be the kind of year where, say, something like Oklahoma beats Texas in October and goes into the Big 12 championship game with 1 loss or none and is in the top 4. And then loses to a 2 or a 3 loss Texas in the Big 12 championship game, right? Or say Alabama goes 12-0, and then finally Kirby Smart solves the puzzle in Atlanta and beats them. We're overdue. We haven't had one of those in several years. I think we're going to have 1 or 2 of those this year.
Yeah, I remember a Saturday, my favorite college football Saturday of all time, and I don't have the exact date, which makes me mad because that means I was underprepared, but you'll remember the game, and I think you can help me. Michigan beat Penn State on the Manningham catch on the same day that
was 2005. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So we had on the same Saturday, we had Michigan win on the Manningham catch. We had the Bush push. We had a crazy Alabama Ole Miss game where Alabama won at the buzzer on a 58-yard field goal. Mm-hmm. That was the John L. Smith, Ohio State, John L. Smith meltdown game at midfield in the soundbite at halftime. And there was a couple other games. I think that was the same day Wisconsin, Minnesota, Wisconsin won on the block punt late in the game where Minnesota opted to punt. It was one of the best Saturdays ever. And we need a couple like that because I think you're exactly right. The sport has become a little predictable. Do you think I like penciling in Clemson and Alabama? Sure. By the way, I love their people. I love their beat writers. I love seeing all those guys every year, but it's getting to be.
Yeah, you got to write. You're tired of writing the same story all the time. I get that.
Yeah, and it's getting to be a little bit of a high school reunion in January all across the country when I see these guys. But as somebody that's in the box around the Michigan writers, around the Ohio State writers, around some of the other teams in the country, I want to see some new blood in there. And quite honestly, I want to see a Big Ten team in the championship game because I think it would be, I'm going to get more page views off that anyway. And it'd be more fun to get a Big Ten team in there.
Well, just like whenever we have those weeks where there's only 1 game involving top 25 teams, right? And they go, and on game day, they're like, well, it's a light schedule. You're getting 3 or 4 upsets, right? That happens every time, right? When the schedule seems like there's not a lot of compelling matchups, that's always when you catch somebody napping. This year, it just seems a fait accompli that Alabama and Clemson, there's no avoiding it, which is exactly why I think this is the year. And what'd be funny is if you ended up with Alabama and Clemson again, it's the Grateful Dead long strange trip. It was this jagged road nobody saw coming. Instead of them just kind of curb stomping their way through the season. But I have a sneaking suspicion that because it looks so ordinary and easy, we're going to get some zaniness this year. So.
Well, I hope you're right. It is a sport that's much better when we have those weekends like that, and it's not auto-programmed. And I think a lot of the 8-team discussion is born out of Clemson and Alabama's dominance because I've been telling people you still got to beat them. And, you can get to the playoff. That's fine. You still got to win 2. Notre Dame found that out the hard way last year, how much depth Clemson has. But we do need a little bit of the zane. We do need it. It's 150th season, Steve. We should have some fun with it.
Good to see you, Bill. Thanks for joining us here on Michigan Podcast. Take care.
Hey, let's do it again before the season starts. I appreciate you, Steve.
You bet. God bless. Hey, quick reminder, now that we're in the off season, especially, and episodes are coming bi-weekly, if you want to keep up with everything that myself and Michael Spath are saying and doing and talking about the Michigan Wolverines, you need to check out our website, wolverinedigest.com. You get a daily morning briefing from me via video. There you see my initial Big Ten basketball power ratings for next season. All kinds of great coverage, and you're going to get even more. And that's a great way to stay up to date on everything maize and blue in between our bi-weekly off-season episodes of Michigan Podcast. Again, just go to www.wolverinedigest.com. This week's Twitter poll, we asked you, what's your favorite college football preview magazine? 51% of you said Phil Steele's. You know who loves Phil Steele's college football magazine? Optometrist. All right? Because, dude, you need like the bifocals I'm wearing right now to read that sucker. It's a great magazine, but it's un poquito. So Phil Steele was number 1 at 51%. Athlon's, though, I agree, Athlon's is really good. And it's really upped its game in recent years, though I'm disappointed they're no longer doing a Big Ten specific magazine. They're at 31%. Lindy's is at 9%. Lindy's is Scoping the Nation, their news and notes portion of their magazine. I've been reading that since I was a teenager. That's some of the most fun reading and amongst all of the college football magazines. Street and Smith's, which is relatively new, taking over for the artist formerly known as the Sporting News, is tied with Lindy's at 9%. That brings us to this week's question of the week. Less vegetables or less vegetables asks, Deace, when should we expect your written college football preview? Look forward to it every year. It's among the most intellectually honest preview there is. Well, I'm working on it right now. It typically comes out anytime from the 4th of July weekend to Major League Baseball All-Star weekend, just whenever we put the finishing touches on it. But I'm in the basement right now. I'm deep in the throes at the Michigan Man Cave putting together this year's preview. And it's always a lot of fun. It's a labor of love, and we'll be unveiling it here when we finish the current series, previewing the season here on Michigan Podcast. The culmination of that series will be the unveiling of my own 2019 college football preview, which, as I said before, if you're new around here, it's more of a forecast of how I think the season will end up going rather than a preview. Thanks to all of you who tuned in for this week's episode. Make sure you follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. You keep checking us out each day at WolverineDigest.com. We're updating the content up there on a daily basis to keep you up to date on everything going on with the Maize and Blue. Give us a like, subscribe, 5-star review, YouTube, the podcast platform of your choice where applicable. Thank you to all of you that have done that for us already. And a thank you as well to our friends at Detroit Sports Podcast for spreading the word about what we do each and every episode right here on Michigan Podcast. Until the next time, go Blue.